Okay, so today we're going deep on some pretty intense stuff you sent us.
Oh, yeah, definitely intense.
Yeah, it's all about this conversation on vaccines and, looking at disease from a historical perspective.
Right, and alternative medicine, too.
Exactly. So we're talking about you know, the Joe Rogan Experience podcast
Hmm.
with Dr. Suzanne Humphries.
Yeah, she's got some interesting views.
Definitely. And it's a long conversation. So
Hmm.
what we're trying to do is pull out the most compelling points.
Yeah, the things that really make you think.
Right, and give you a good understanding of all the different sides of this without getting totally lost in the weeds.
Yeah, because it's a lot to unpack.
It is, and it's what's really striking is that right from the start they jump into this idea of questioning dogma,
Yeah.
like especially when it comes to vaccines.
Like challenging the things we think we just know.
Right, and they talk about how important it is to keep an open mind and really see the full picture
Like a
of
360-degree view.
yeah, exactly, and not just accepting one perspective, especially if there might be I don't know, ulterior motives behind it.
Like financial incentives or something.
Exactly. So right away, it sets the stage for a discussion that's really challenging some commonly held beliefs.
It definitely gets you thinking critically.
For sure. And then they kind of move into this area of natural remedies.
Which is interesting because it's often dismissed.
Yeah, it's like, oh, that's just hippie stuff.
Right, exactly. But they bring up examples like using cinnamon to help manage blood sugar.
Yeah, and vitamin C in traditional medicine.
Right, and there's this kind of funny moment where they acknowledge that, like,
That sometimes the hippies are right.
yeah, like on some things the hippies seem to have gotten it right.
And they even talk about garlic as a potential way to fight staph infections without creating drug resistance.
Yeah, like without the bacteria becoming resistant.
Right, which is a huge problem with antibiotics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it makes you wonder if maybe we've been too quick to dismiss some of these traditional approaches.
Yeah, like maybe there's more overlap between conventional medicine and alternative medicine than we think.
Definitely. And then they get into this really interesting point about vitamin A.
Oh, yeah. This one was surprising.
So apparently both getting measles naturally and getting the measles vaccine can cause a drop in vitamin A levels.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's not something that's commonly talked about, but they suggest that even if you get vaccinated, supplementing with vitamin A might be helpful.
Interesting. But, they don't really go into detail about how significant that drop in vitamin A is.
Right. It's more of a passing comment, but it does make you think about the potential broader impacts of vaccination that we don't always consider.
Yeah, like maybe there are other things going on that we haven't fully investigated.
Exactly. And then another point they bring up is that even though vaccines are regulated, their actual composition might vary more than we realize.
Oh, that's kind of concerning.
Yeah, and they suggest that this variability could be one reason why people have such different reactions to vaccines.
Like some people have no side effects and others have really bad ones.
Exactly. And we tend to think of vaccines as being these perfectly standardized products.
Yeah, like every dose is exactly the same.
Right. But if there's actually a degree of variation, that could explain some of the inconsistencies we see.
That makes sense. So where does the legal side of things come into play?
Well, they talk about the history of vaccine injury acts, starting with the whole swine flu vaccine situation in 1976.
Oh, yeah, that was a mess.
It was. And that led to the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986.
So what they're suggesting is that by protecting vaccine manufacturers from lawsuits, the government might have unintentionally shifted their priorities.
Right, like maybe there's less incentive for them to be absolutely sure about safety if they know they're not going to be held liable.
That's a good point. It definitely makes you think about accountability and how these policies might affect how vaccines are developed and manufactured.
Definitely. And then the conversation takes a bit of a personal turn when Dr. Humphries starts talking about her own background.
Oh, yeah, she was a nephrologist, right? A kidney specialist.
That's right. And she initially believed in vaccination, but then she started seeing patients who developed kidney problems after
Oh.
getting flu shots.
And that made her question everything.
She describes it as a turning point where she realized that maybe she didn't have the whole picture.
It's pretty powerful to hear a doctor talk about that kind of experience.
Yeah, it shows that even medical professionals can have their beliefs challenged by what they see in their practice.
And that sometimes unexpected observations can lead to really big questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So from there, they kind of shift gears and start talking about polio.
Which is always interesting because it's considered this huge success story for vaccines.
Right, like the poster child for vaccine effectiveness.
But they present a different perspective, suggesting that polio might still be around, but it's just being diagnosed differently now.
Yeah, they point to changes in the diagnostic criteria around the time the vaccine was introduced.
Like maybe what used to be called polio is now called something else.
Exactly, and that this could explain the apparent drop in cases.
That's a pretty bold claim, isn't it?
It is. It challenges the whole narrative that the vaccine eradicated polio.
And they don't just stop there. They actually question the role of the vaccine itself.
Right. They argue that other factors were likely involved in the decline of paralytic polio.
Like what kind of factors?
Well, they talk about environmental factors, specifically the use of DDT and arsenic-based pesticides.
Oh, wow. So they're saying that exposure to these chemicals could have been misdiagnosed as polio.
That's the suggestion. They mentioned the timing and geographical overlap between heavy DDT use and polio outbreaks.
And they even bring up this historical practice of dipping cows in arsenic solutions.
Yeah, which is pretty wild when you think about it.
It is. It makes you wonder how much of what we thought we knew about polio was actually influenced by environmental factors.
Right. And then they drop this really surprising statistic that 95 to 99% of polio infections are actually asymptomatic.
Wait, really? So most people who get infected with polio don't even know they have it?
That's what they're saying. They describe the polio virus as a commensal organism, meaning it can live in the body without causing harm.
Like the bacteria that live on our skin.
Exactly. And they use the example of the Javanti Indians who had immunity to all three polio strains, but no history of paralytic polio.
So that supports the idea that polio isn't inherently this devastating disease.
Right. It suggests that something else must have been going on in the cases where it did cause paralysis.
That makes sense. And then they get into this really controversial claim about a Rockefeller lab in 1916.
Oh, yeah. This one's a bit out there.
So apparently they claim that this lab was trying to create a more pathogenic strain of polio.
Like a more dangerous version.
Right. And that this supposedly led to a severe epidemic.
It's a pretty serious accusation, and it goes against the idea that viruses naturally become less virulent over time.
Yeah, like that they evolved to become less harmful because it's in their best interest to keep their hosts alive.
Exactly, but they're suggesting that human intervention might have actually made the virus more deadly.
Which is a pretty disturbing thought.
It is. And then they move on to talking about vaccine-derived polio.
Which I guess is when the weakened virus in the vaccine reverts back to a more dangerous form.
Right, and this was mostly a problem with the oral polio vaccine, the one that was given on a sugar cube.
Yeah, I remember those.
So they mention current examples of finding vaccine strains in sewage and how that sometimes leads to mass vaccination campaigns.
Which is kind of ironic, isn't it? Like trying to contain the spread of a virus that came from a vaccine.
It is, and they also talk about the shift from the oral vaccine to the injectable vaccine.
And they claim that early versions of the injectable vaccine actually had higher rates of paralytic polio.
Which is pretty concerning if true.
It is. It really makes you think about the complexities of vaccine development and how even with good intentions, things can go wrong.
For sure, and then they make the argument that conditions like transverse myelitis and acute flaccid paralysis are basically modern-day polio.
So they're saying that the disease hasn't disappeared, it's just got a new name.
That's the suggestion. They even use the analogy of the iron lung being replaced by the ventilator.
Like it's the same problem, just with different technology.
Exactly. And it raises the question of whether we're still seeing polio-like illnesses, but attributing them to different causes.
That's a really interesting point. And then they shift gears a bit and start talking about aluminum in vaccines.
And its potential link to allergies.
Yeah, they specifically talk about how aluminum adjuvants might skew the immune system towards the Th2 response, which is associated with allergies.
And how this might be connected to the rise in food allergies.
Which is a huge problem these days.
It is. They then contrast this with breastfeeding, which they present as a natural way for babies to develop tolerance.
Right, like breast milk helps the immune system learn what's safe and what's not.
Exactly. And the implication is that vaccine-induced Th2 responses might be disrupting this natural process.
So they're basically saying that vaccines could be contributing to the allergy epidemic.
That's the suggestion, and it raises concerns about the long-term effects of aluminum in vaccines.
Especially on developing immune systems.
Oh, right. And speaking of breastfeeding, they really emphasize its incredible benefits.
Yeah, it's not just about nutrition.
They talk about all these amazing components in breast milk, like Hamlet, which can kill cancer cells.
Wow, I didn't know that.
And stem cells and activated T cells.
It's like breast milk is a superfood.
It really is. And they also mention the transfer of cellular immunity through breast milk.
So it's not just about antibodies, it's about passing on actual immune cells.
Right, which is Pretty amazing.
It is. It makes you realize how complex and sophisticated the immune system is.
Definitely. And then they make this interesting claim that breastfeeding might actually influence how a baby responds to vaccination.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they say that breastfeeding might promote a more balanced Th1 response, while formula feeding might lead to a more Th2 skewed response.
So how you feed your baby could potentially affect how their body reacts to vaccines.
That's the suggestion. It adds another layer of complexity to the whole discussion about vaccine safety and effectiveness.
For sure. And then they bring up this historical connection between contaminated infant formula and polio,
Oh, yeah, apparently some of the formula back then was contaminated with pesticides.
because the cows were eating pesticide-laden feed.
Right, and this contamination is suggested as another possible factor in the polio epidemic.
So it's not just about the virus itself or the vaccine. There are all these other environmental factors to consider.
Exactly. It paints a much more nuanced picture of how these diseases might have spread and why they affected people the way they did.
Definitely. And then they move on to the smallpox vaccine and reveal a pretty disturbing history.
Yeah, the early days of smallpox vaccination were pretty rough.
So they talk about how these vaccines were made using pus from various animals,
Cows, horses, even donkeys.
and sometimes even human cadavers.
And this was all mixed with glycerin and marketed as pure lymph.
It's kind of hard to believe that's how they used to make vaccines.
It is, and they also mention allegations of bacteria and fungus being present in some of these early vaccines.
Which is not surprising considering how they were made.
Right, and then there's this mysterious fact that specimens of the Dryvax vaccine were destroyed.
Which raises questions about why that might have happened.
Yeah, like were they trying to hide something?
It's definitely suspicious, but then they present this historical view from the late 1600s suggesting that smallpox wasn't always this incredibly deadly disease.
Right. Apparently some people back then thought it was relatively treatable with supportive care.
Which is surprising because we always hear about how devastating smallpox was.
Yeah, it was definitely a serious disease, but they argue that its impact might have been less severe in earlier times before the Industrial Revolution.
And they point to the unsanitary conditions in cities as a major factor in how bad diseases became.
Like the overcrowding and lack of proper sanitation created the perfect breeding ground for disease.
Right, and this just happened to coincide with the introduction of vaccines.
So they emphasize that correlation doesn't equal causation.
Like, just because two things happen around the same time doesn't mean one caused the other.
Exactly. And they use the example of diarrhea and some of the crazy historical treatments for
Are they
it.
bloodletting and inducing vomiting?
It sounds awful.
It does, and it highlights how important it is to look at the historical context and not jump to conclusions.
For sure. And then they bring up this interesting fact about arsenic being used as a traditional medicine.
And how arsenic poisoning can actually mimic the symptoms of polio.
Yeah, like spinal problems and fevers.
So they're suggesting that some cases of polio might have actually been arsenic poisoning?
That's the implication. And it further muddies the waters of how polio was diagnosed and understood in the past.
And then they get into the use of mercury in vaccines.
Specifically, thimerosal, which was used as a preservative.
Right, and they point out the obvious contradiction that mercury is a known neurotoxin, but it was considered acceptable to use in vaccines.
And that it's classified as hazardous waste.
It's like, wait a minute, which is it?
They do talk about the difference between ethyl mercury and methyl mercury and how they're processed by the body.
But the overall message is that mercury is toxic, period.
Right, and then they shift the focus to aluminum, which is another common vaccine ingredient.
And also a neurotoxin,
And aluminum can cross the blood-brain barrier.
which means it can get into the brain.
Exactly, and they point out that aluminum is still used in many vaccines today.
So while they acknowledge that the ethyl mercury in thimerosal supposedly leaves the body fairly quickly, they're more concerned about the long-term effects of aluminum.
And then they go on to talk about what they call the long history of propaganda surrounding vaccines.
Like trying to convince people that vaccines are safe and effective no matter what.
Right, and they allege that doctors who speak out against vaccines have been intimidated and silenced.
And that information questioning vaccine safety has been suppressed.
They even cite a document from a 1984 Federal Register that supposedly states that any doubts about the safety of the vaccination program must not be allowed to exist.
Wow, that's pretty heavy-handed.
It is, and they also talk about the influence of industry funding on research.
Like how studies that are funded by vaccine manufacturers might be biased.
Right, and that this can create a situation where only certain narratives are allowed to be heard.
It's definitely something to think about. And then they get into the contamination of early polio vaccines with
Oh,
SV40.
yeah, that's a whole other can of worms.
So SV40 is a virus found in monkeys, and it was accidentally present in some of the early polio vaccines.
Because they were using monkey kidney cells to grow the virus.
And the concern is that SV40 can cause cancer in humans.
Yeah, and they talk about Dr. Bernice Eddy, who discovered this contamination and how her findings were allegedly suppressed.
And how Maurice Hilleman later confirmed the presence of SV40 in these vaccines.
And the claim is that SV40 might be contagious among humans.
Which is really scary if true.
It is, and they even say that SV40 contaminated vaccine stocks were used into the 1990s.
Wow, it's a long time.
It is, if that's true, it's a major public health scandal.
And then Dr. Humphries expresses her belief that cancer rates have increased since the introduction of widespread vaccination.
And she specifically points to a rise in kidney cancer rates.
Which she correlates with the period when SV40 contaminated vaccines were being used.
And they also discuss a possible link between SV40 and protein-losing kidney diseases in children.
It's pretty disturbing to think that a contaminant in a vaccine could have such long-term consequences.
And then they talk about the experiences of parents who believe their children were harmed by vaccines.
Especially in the context of autism.
Right, and how these parents often feel dismissed and ignored by the medical establishment.
Like their concerns aren't taken seriously.
And they criticize the studies that have been used to refute the link between vaccines and autism.
Claiming that they're flawed or biased.
And they talk about how difficult it is for these parents to get their voices heard.
Because they're often labeled as anti-vaccine or conspiracy theorists.
Right, and then the conversation moves on to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Which is obviously a very sensitive topic.
They make claims about various adverse effects of the COVID-19 vaccines being underreported.
And allege that hospitals are financially incentivized to administer the vaccines.
And they express concerns about specific genetic material allegedly present in the vaccines.
They even called the recommendation to vaccinate 6-month-old babies insane.
It's definitely a very strong opinion.
And they question the role of groups like ACIP in making vaccine recommendations.
Alleging that these groups have financial ties to the vaccine industry.
And they highlight the financial incentives for doctors and hospitals to meet vaccination targets.
Suggesting that this creates a conflict of interest.
And then they touch on the historical influence of figures like Rockefeller in shaping the medical establishment.
And how they shifted the focus towards pharmaceutical drugs and away from natural remedies.
And they mention the formation of the AMA in this context.
And they blame this historical shift for the dismissal of natural cures.
And then Dr. Humphries shares some of her own experiences of observing adverse reactions to vaccines in her patients.
Like kidney failure after flu shots and severe high blood pressure after a tetanus shot.
And she talks about how her colleagues often dismiss these observations.
Saying that they needed randomized controlled trials to prove a causal link.
Which is frustrating because individual case reports can be really valuable.
Especially when you're dealing with rare adverse events.
And then they touch on the experience of being censored and deplatformed for talking about vaccines online.
Which highlights the difficulty of having open and honest discussions about this topic.
And then they argue that the increase in lifespan over the past century is mostly due to improvements in sanitation, nutrition, and living conditions.
Not medical interventions, like vaccines and antibiotics.
They say that medical interventions have only contributed a small percentage to the overall increase in lifespan.
Which is an interesting perspective.
It makes you wonder if we've overestimated the impact of modern medicine.
And then they question the logic behind the shingles vaccine.
Which is a vaccine for a virus that's already in your body.
Right, it's a reactivation of the chickenpox virus.
And they point out that there's been an alleged increase in shingles cases since the introduction of the chickenpox vaccine.
Which they suggest might be a consequence of disrupting the natural immunity to the virus.
And then they talk about tetanus.
And how important it is to clean wounds properly.
And they mention the potential benefits of vitamin C in preventing and treating tetanus.
And they point out that the tetanus vaccine doesn't guarantee immunity.
And they even bring up the possibility of tetanus spores being present in contaminated menstrual pads.
It's a lot to think about.
It is. And then Dr. Humphries reflects on her own journey from being a conventional doctor to becoming a critic of mainstream vaccine narratives.
She talks about her disillusionment with the pharmaceutical-focused medical system.
And her embrace of a more holistic approach to health.
Focusing on the body's natural healing abilities.
And addressing underlying factors like inflammation and toxicity.
And she mentions exploring alternative therapies.
And viewing the body as an electromagnetic entity.
It's a pretty radical shift in perspective.
And then they bring up the influence of financial incentives in medicine once again.
Talking about how the system might profit more from ongoing treatments than from cures,
And they share this interesting historical anecdote about using apple cider vinegar to treat smallpox.
which highlights the potential of natural remedies that might be overlooked today.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that this conversation is full of controversial claims and challenging perspectives.
It's a lot to process.
It is, but it's important to remember that we're just presenting the information as it was shared in the original source material.
We're not endorsing any particular viewpoint
Our goal is to give you a comprehensive overview of the conversation and let you decide what you think.
and to encourage you to do your own research and critical thinking.
So, what stood out to you the most?
I think what struck me is how complex this issue really is.
Yeah, there's so much more to it than just vaccines are good or vaccines are bad.
It's about the history of medicine, the influence of environmental factors, the complexities of the immune system, and the role of financial incentives.
And it's about the importance of questioning what we think we know and being open to different perspectives.
Even if they challenge our existing beliefs.
So, what's the takeaway for our listeners?
I think the main takeaway is to be curious, to ask questions, and to not be afraid to dig deeper.
And to remember that the conversation about vaccines and health is constantly evolving.
There's always more to learn.
And the more informed we are, the better equipped we are to make decisions about our own health and the health of our families.
And in a world where scientific consensus is often presented as absolute, it's important to remember that science is a process, not a destination.
And that what we consider to be true today might be overturned tomorrow.
So the question is, what assumptions are we making today that future generations will look back on and question?
And how can we stay open to new information and be willing to adjust our beliefs as needed?
That's the challenge.
And it's a challenge that we all need to embrace.
For the sake of our own health and the health of humanity.
Absolutely.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.
Bye.
Bye.